All right. Well, I hope you guys are all doing well. As usual. Well, usual being I did this last week. We're going to continue this. Um, for two of the questions on your notes, put something that happened on this day in history. That would be the 14th of April. So April 14th. But one thing that happened on this day in history and one famous person who was born on this day in history, April 14th. So we finished off with Eisenhower's time in office with our last notes. And today we are going to begin talking about John F. Kennedy's time as president. We're not going to cover his whole presidency, but we'll cover part of it today and then the rest of it on Thursday. Next week, I will. We were not having a Zoom meeting this week. We will still have them sometimes, but next week I think we will have one on Monday. Um, I want to discuss the circumstances of John F. Kennedy's assassination. And so it's been something that's fascinated me since I was in high school. Um, spoiler alert, I guess for that, I actually do believe in a conspiracy there. I don't know what the conspiracy is. Like, I don't know all the facts or details, but I do believe in that particular conspiracy theory. I don't believe Lee Harvey Oswald did it all by himself. There's just too much evidence, too much proof showing that he could not have done it by himself, on top of the fact that there are witnesses who believed other people might have been involved. So we'll get to that, but I want to do that next Monday. We'll get to his assassination on Thursday, but we'll kind of discuss it next Monday. And then next week, we will have our first test that is online. We'll go over details of that next week, making sure you guys are prepared for that. We won't have a study guide, however, because you'll be able to use your notes in your book and all the resources. So, like I said, we'll give more details about that next week. So, let's begin our talk about John F. Kennedy really leading a new generation. And it really is almost like a changing of the guard. Kennedy is a very young president, as we're going to see. Now, by 1960, John F. Kennedy's appearance was everywhere. He had a handsome face, a beautiful wife, a lovely little girl, a son on the way. They were kind of the idealistic family. He was on thousands of magazines covers. He was actually a Pulitzer Prize winning author of a book called Profiles in Courage, which basically did some historical synopsis of different people that John F. Kennedy said were courageous throughout history. And really, people began to notice his charisma. This is one of the first times, really, that you see charisma playing a huge role in the election of a president and just the kind of presence that John F. Kennedy had. Really, from a young age, John F. Kennedy was groomed to be the president. He had planned a presidential run for quite some time and had lost in 1956 in his effort to become the Democratic vice presidential nominee, and he continued to push for the presidency 4 years later. Now, might be like, how was he groomed for the presidency? Well, his father, Joseph, initially was planning on Joseph Jr. or Joe Jr. to run for president, which would be John F. Kennedy's older brother. But he was not able to run because he died in World War II. Joe Kennedy Jr. did as a pilot. He fought valiantly. He was a very brave, just like John F. Kennedy was a war hero as well. And Joe Jr. obviously was not going to be able to run for president because of that. But from then on, it became more John F. Kennedy was going to run for president. John F. Kennedy was a war hero, but I'm not going to go over that here. I'm assigning something for you guys to read through and to summarize in a paragraph telling me how he was a war hero, because he really was. John F. Kennedy, interestingly, had a lot of chronic illnesses. One of those things was continual back and shoulder pain, which makes his war heroics all the more impressive. Now, as you go into this election cycle, it isn't clear early on that Kennedy would be the nominee. Adlai Stevenson once again wants to put his name in the ring to run for president. Hubert H. Humphrey from Minnesota, who had a strong record on farm rights and civil rights, and was very articulate in his views, was seen as someone who had a good chance to win the nomination. He had also proposed the Peace Corps and a Food for Peace program. He also had one of the most successful legislators in Senate history, Lyndon Baines Johnson from Texas, who was very skillful and had served in the Senate for quite some time, and he really did know how to get things done. These were all people kind of running for the candidacy here. They were all older and more seasoned, and seemed like better potential presidential candidates. Now, I'm typically going to call John F. Kennedy JFK, but he also was known by Jack. That was a nickname he was known as. Um, his own achievements uh, were not actually, as far as government goes, John F. Kennedy's achievements weren't that great. He had never sponsored a major law. He had never had an important initiative bearing his name. Uh, However, he was aggressive in his ambition to become president of the United States. And he also had a brother who was extremely ambitious as well, Bobby Kennedy, who also had a lifelong reputation for political ruthlessness. So John F. Kennedy may not have had a lot of um, big bills tied to his name, but he had been an active member in politics for quite some time now. Now, one of the things that people did think might keep him from getting elected was he was Catholic. And well, spoiler, obviously you know he's going to win. That part I'm pretty sure you're aware of. But he's the first Catholic president ever elected. No Catholic had ever been elected president of the United States, and some people felt like maybe he would not be able to be elected because of his Catholicism. Um, so they were concerned about that. During his campaign, Frank Sinatra sang a Kennedy campaign song. Bobby Kennedy was once again Robert Kennedy, but he's known as Bobby. He was uh, part of helping head the campaign for John F. Kennedy. He got Franklin Roosevelt Jr., FDR's son, to basically back John F. Kennedy. So they got a lot of right people in place. John F. Kennedy was nominated eventually on the first ballot for the Democratic nomination. It actually ended up not being as close as people thought as far as his candidacy for the presidential nominee went. The general election is going to actually be pretty close. Now, a question you need to answer, which isn't on your screen here, but it's going to be important you answer. Lyndon Baines Johnson was named the candidate for vice presidency for John F. Kennedy. They actually are very different. But the reason LBJ was named the vice presidential candidate was because the Democrats desperately needed to win Texas. And LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, was from Texas. So they felt like this would help Kennedy win Texas. Since Kennedy was from Massachusetts, they felt like he was a Democrat who didn't really identify well with Texas. So they chose Lyndon Johnson, which did not please Robert Kennedy. He didn't like LBJ being elected as the vice president. As far as the Republicans, they decided to run Richard Nixon. He had been vice president. He was a strong anti-communist. He had done a lot to help build up the Republican Party for 8 years while he was serving under Eisenhower. And people had seen him in a positive light because when Eisenhower was ill, when he had the heart problems, Nixon had performed admirably. He had done a good job while short spells. There wasn't really a whole lot of competition against him. Governor Nelson A. Rockefeller of New York, who was a Republican, but a more middle of the ground Republican, never seriously was able to do a lot to hamper Nixon's chances of being the Republican nominee. During the election cycle, Kennedy urged a stronger response to the Soviets, something that Nixon had already been doing. He called for a new frontier. Nixon was hampered by a pledge to visit all 50 states, and this was the first election that had all 50 states. Alaska had become a state in 1959 and Hawaii in 1960. And back then, air travel wasn't as common. So this was kind of a bad decision by Nixon. Once again, we talked about this last year in government class. You don't really want to visit all the states. You just want to visit the states that have a lot of um, electoral votes that are close, that you possibly could get to go in your favor. You don't want to visit states where you're clearly going to win or clearly going to lose because it will be a waste of your time. You also had some of the first use of television as far as debates going on during this election. Nixon was a more experienced politician, and many people felt like in the debates he would win clearly. Interestingly, the perceptions were different depending on how you heard or watched this first speech. Those who heard the speech on the radio felt Nixon had won. Those who saw the speech on TV felt that Kennedy had won. So TV actually helps Kennedy out here quite a bit. Kennedy appears calmer. Obviously, he's more attractive as well. And he just appears to have a confidence level when he's on camera. So in that way, television helped John F. Kennedy get elected. I'm not saying it's the only factor, but this is a very close election. So it does seem apparent that TV probably played a role, maybe for the first time in history, in getting a president elected. So as far as the popular vote, Kennedy won 49.7% of the popular vote, 49.7. Nixon won 49.5% of the popular vote. So very close as far as the popular vote. Now, the electoral vote's not as close. John F. Kennedy wins 303, Nixon wins 219. But imagine, Kennedy doesn't perform as well on TV, or that Nixon doesn't plan to visit all 50 states and instead focuses on those states that were really close. Maybe Nixon wins. This was actually a very close election. I'm sure I'm going to have to get a little drink here. Still to this day, the highest voter turnout in U.S. history, 64% turnout figure, which is a very, very high number. It has not been matched since. One of the reasons given for it not being matched since is that there was a large decline in voter turnout when they changed the voting age to 18. So I want you guys to be voters who turn out when you're 18, 19, 20. But in general, younger people don't turn out to vote as much as older people. So voter turnout has gone down over time because of the drop in the voters' age. Kennedy won, obviously, the Catholic vote. He won the Jewish vote. Blacks voted for him in large numbers as well. And he became the youngest man ever to be elected as president. Now, that is actually elected. That's important because he was not the youngest man to be president. Theodore Roosevelt was actually younger, but he was the vice president who became president. When Theodore Roosevelt got reelected, he was older than John F. Kennedy. Well, you would hope there might be just a honeymoon period and that things could go easy for John F. Kennedy as soon as he takes office. However, that was not the case. His inaugural address, however, is pretty famous. He has some pretty famous quotes from it. So I'm going to read a few things from his inaugural address. He said, "The rights of man come not from the generosity of the state, but from the hand of God." He also said this is one of the most famous phrases ever uttered by any president: "Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country." He then concluded his speech with these words: "With a good conscience, our only sure reward, with history the final judge of our deeds, let us go forth to lead the land we love, asking his blessing and his help, but knowing that here on earth God's work must truly be our own." So he's actually imploring that God be involved in helping make America successful. Now, when he took office, he became aware of a CIA initiative that had been sponsored by Eisenhower to try to overthrow the communist dictator Fidel Castro in Cuba. That they would sponsor Cuban exiles and they would try to fight against the Cuban communist regime. At the last minute, however, John F. Kennedy withdrew the U.S. air cover for the Cuban exile army that was storming ashore. The Cuban exiles may never have stood a chance, but pulling out the uh, air cover guaranteed their failure. Now, you may be like, why would John F. Kennedy do this? Because it was a fiasco and a complete failure. Kennedy may have been trying to keep the support of his United Nations ambassador and the liberal wing of his own Democratic Party in trying to veto direct support to the Cuban exiles. JFK, so some people began to accuse, well, JFK, obviously we told you guys he wasn't experienced enough and was going to do a poor job. John F. Kennedy did, and I appreciate this about him, he did take full blame and acknowledge his fault in the Bay of Pigs fiasco. He didn't try to hide behind anybody else. He said it was his fault. JFK won the hearts of the French people. He and his wife and family in general they were from the upper class and they presented themselves well. The people in France were charmed by Jacqueline Kennedy. He simply just said, "I am the man who accompanied Jacqueline Kennedy to Paris because she was so well received." This does lead, however, to some problems because Kennedy and Khrushchev eventually come to some meetings in Vienna in June of 1961. Obviously, the failure of the Bay of Pigs helps Khrushchev and gives him kind of some power over Kennedy here at these meetings. I'm going to read a quote from Khrushchev. It's going to use a phrase that I normally wouldn't use, but it's a quote. "Berlin is the testicles of the West. Every time I want to make the West scream, I squeeze on Berlin." So a lot of what they're going to talk about here is Berlin, and this is when you're going to begin to see a lot of the turmoil, and the Berlin Wall is going to go up here soon. But Khrushchev, trying to pressure Kennedy, is going to keep doing things to Berlin to try to create some of that. He's trying to bully John F. Kennedy. He begins threatening war, trying to intimidate Kennedy. He signed a separate treaty with the East German satellite to force Western allies out of Berlin, and said that force will be met with force. Changing directions, Kennedy tried to interest Khrushchev in a treaty to ban the testing of nuclear weapons in the atmosphere. It had actually been proven that they had put so much strontium-90, radioactive elements, in the atmosphere that it possibly could be having problems and could even be detected in children's milk. Now, they don't create a big treaty here, but this does begin the groundwork between the Soviet Union and the United States to start limiting nuclear testing. And eventually, this is going to be quite a while from now, but even limiting the amount of nuclear weapons. Basically, obviously, the Bay of Pigs had emboldened Khrushchev. The Soviets also, going into this meeting, could feel confident because they had launched the first manned space flight in history. April 12th, 1961. Major Yuri Gagarin orbited the Earth 3 times. The Soviets' gain in space presented Kennedy with a serious challenge. America had begun developing their own space program, which we talked about early on. It was called the Mercury program. And they tried to promote clean-cut, button-down young military pilots and tried to make them into heroes before they even set foot in space. The American astronauts were presented in that way. The Soviets began talking about putting a man on the moon. What would come next? People started thinking moon colonies, missile bases from the moon, as Americans began to feel threatened by this. Khrushchev thought the success of the space efforts for the Soviet Union would also prove the validity of Marxist-Leninism, that communism was a better form of government, and that atheism would win over Christianity. In fact, cosmonaut Gagarin, who was a committed communist and atheist, when he had seen the heavens during the first orbital flight, he grinned and replied, "Niet Boyga," which means no God. So when Yuri Gagarin was asked what he had seen in the heavens during his first orbital flight, his reply was no God. Okay, so the space race, we're going to find this is really interesting to me because I didn't actually realize this, but the space until a couple years ago, I'm saying Um, but the space race actually ends up being not just a challenge between the Soviet Union and the United States, but a challenge between atheism and Christianity, and which one of those would be correct as well. These young American astronauts who were clean shaved were those who were called they had the right stuff to succeed, the right stuff to make the move. Now, America's obviously already lost the space race as far as first man in space, first person to orbit the Earth in space, first satellite. So it's like, how can America win the space race? Well, Kennedy begins to redefine the space race. The first woman in space is going to be Soviet. The first spacewalk is going to be Soviet. First long-term orbital flight is going to be the Soviets. So he moves the finish line and the overarching goal to the moon. Who can reach the moon first? That becomes the goal of the United States. Top of that, we talked about this with the last lecture. America also does this all in public. So when Yuri Gagarin goes into space, they don't publicize it. He comes out and gives a interview, but he is not, they're not doing video from space or him talking about things while he's in space, but the Americans would make an effort to do that. So Navy Lieutenant Commander Alan B. Shepard and Air Force Captain Virgil Gus Grissom rocketed into space, the heat shield of John Glenn's Friendship 7 space capsule nearly came off, an event that we recorded and shared for the world. We'll be talking a little bit more about that in a moment. Some opposed the Apollo program, mostly Republicans in this case, which I think in this case it was wrong. They should not have done that because this was a way to kind of prove America could defeat the Soviets in this area. It's also during this time period that you begin to see the building of the Berlin Wall. Khrushchev moves to seal off East Berlin from West Berlin, seeking a better life. Really, what ends up happening though is you're getting more of a wall around West Berlin to keep East Berliners from getting into that area. So this is an important moment. Some people would try to, well, before the wall is completely built, a lot of East Berliners got into West Berlin or tried to get into West Berlin at least. And there were stories of hundreds of people who were shot down trying to escape over the wall. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to watch the movie Bridge of Spies, but I encourage you, if you haven't seen it, to watch it. It's a very interesting story. It takes place during the beginning of the building of the Berlin Wall, but it's really about the exchange of two spies, Rudolf Abel, who was a Soviet spy who was caught in the United States, and Francis Gary Powers, who we mentioned last week, who was the U-2 spy pilot who was shot down. They do come to an agreement to release both spies. They also come to an agreement to release a American college student who was captured in East Berlin as well. Very good movie. I encourage you to watch it. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on that, but that's something you could do. But the Berlin Wall would stand for, over around 30 years, and hundreds would lose their life trying to escape from the Berlin Wall. So let's get back to John Glenn. His space shuttle and space flight was called Friendship 7. It was the first U.S. effort to send a man to orbit around the Earth. Like I said, this was much more publicized than it was for the Soviets. Glenn takes off. Things go well in the takeoff. But he from space does begin to report that he felt like the space capsule's heat shield had been deployed too soon. So when you re-enter into the Earth's atmosphere, obviously the shuttles get very, very hot. In fact, the temperatures outside the capsule rose to 9,500 degrees Fahrenheit, which is not that much lower than the surface of the sun. That's how hot it gets when you re-enter into the Earth's atmosphere. So as he comes back in, loses radio contact, the people watching on TV, they have to hold their breath and just hope that John Glenn makes it back. But he was able to survive through the re-entry into the atmosphere, and eventually his his shuttle or the capsule that he is in splashes down in the water, and he makes it back, becoming the first American to orbit the Earth. Interestingly, a Soviet cosmonaut proclaimed his view that the communist ideology was confirmed, that he didn't see God in space. John Glenn responded, "The God I believe in isn't so small that I thought I would run into him just a little above the atmosphere." So, like I said, it's an interesting thing to consider that the space race becomes a spiritual thing, not just a thing about pride for your countries. Okay, so that's it as far as notes today. It's going to be a little bit shorter. I did say I'm going to assign a thing for John F. Kennedy's military success in World War II. Um, also wants you to answer this question, kind of like the color question and the movie question. So it's pretty simple, and maybe you don't have one, but if you don't, maybe you'll come up with one. But what is your favorite number? So if you have a favorite number, mine's 13. Um, so I guess I will let you guys go, and we'll be doing this again in a couple days. See you guys.